The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. A very, very happy new year to you. We are starting the webinar now. I understand people will continue to join, and so welcome to everybody. Welcome to this first stakeholder forum hosted by the co-chairs of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Process and the Secretariat, and also our first webinar of the year. There are going to be many more to come, so please join us in the future too. I will now hand over to the co-chairs. Thanks a lot.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, the first of a series, as Jyoti has said, that we're going to be hosting. I would first like to thank you very much. I see the counter is now over 300, and I know we're expecting close to 1,000 people attending. We would like to thank the Executive Secretary and their staff for the diligent work in preparing this webinar, and members of the COP Bureau for their support. This past year has been extremely difficult for all of us. Some of our colleagues and family friends were sick and are recovering, and this has all taken a tremendous toll in terms of life, personal suffering, disruption of our daily life. We've all done the best to join force and find ways to cope with the challenge we're facing, and we need to continue to move ahead. On a positive note, we have not lost our determination or momentum toward the development of a new framework for global action on biodiversity. However, our capacity to discuss face-to-face and engage in a one-to-one conversation that we like has been challenged. And this brings to the need to develop new methods and new ways to working together, like what we're doing today. Francis, my co-chair, and I were informed that many of you stakeholders have had concern and challenges in getting your voice heard and in the virtual meeting formats. And in addition, and separate from that, we've noticed that many complex subjects continue to come up during the discussion. And we felt that a forum and more in-depth consideration could help us break down those big issues into blocks we can understand. Therefore, we hope to address both these concerns in a new series of informal webinars. We would like to provide an equal opportunity for all stakeholders, both parties and non-parties, to make their voice heard. We also that we can informally explore many of the key issues related to the framework, especially related to the transition identified in GBO5. As well, we'll able to provide some information, because obviously this will be useful. This webinar is an opportunity for all to exchange informally on these issues. And I would like to remind everyone that it is not a negotiation session. I would also like to kindly ask that all speakers limit their statement to 3 minutes. 1,000 registration, 2 hours. We only have space for a limited number of people, so please respect the 3 minutes. Our first webinar today is themed Exploring the Linkage Between Climate Change and Biodiversity for the Development of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is an incredibly important topic, as you've told us, and we're confident that we all benefit from the thorough exploration of this issue. Now, I will turn to Francis. Francis, the floor is yours. And Francis, for the first and probably not the last time this year, I think you're on mute.
Francis, we still cannot hear you. Francis, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Co-Chair Basil. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we will focus our discussion today on one of the world's most complex and urgent issues. We will examine the linkages between the issues of climate change and biodiversity and the ways we can improve synergies between climate change and biodiversity actions. We will also discuss some possible ways we can enhance coordination between the UNFCCC and the CBD. We will begin the webinar with opening remarks that will set the stage for our discussion, which we hope will set the context for exploring the key linkages between the actions to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity and efforts to mitigate and adapt to a rapidly changing climate. This will be followed by an in-depth presentation on the linkages between the UNFCCC and the CBD and ways to ensure coherent approaches to both conventions. Following presentations, we will invite all participants to share your views and ask questions, if time will allow for us to respond to the questions. Finally, let me underscore an important point, which of course my coach has just mentioned. We are here today to listen and learn, not to negotiate. This webinar is not a negotiation session. It is an informal webinar intended to provide a discussion space to educate ourselves, increase our knowledge of different perspectives, and improve our understanding of the many complex issues that will help us along our journey towards our post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you, and with that, I will hand over the microphone to Basil.
Thank you. We distinguished participants were very fortunate to have two excellent presenters today, so to help us set the frame. First, we will give the floor to Dr. Ajay Mathur, Director General of TERI, the Energy Resource Institute of India, to provide us with some context for the discussion today. Dr. Mathur, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Basil. Thank you, Francis. It's a pleasure for me to join all of you and the speaker, the other expert speaker, Mr. Charles Barber, in this session. What I'd like to do is to propose that the climate change and the biodiversity actions, I will focus more on actions. Mr. Barber will focus more on the convention linkages. I would like to suggest that the actions make sense. They need and should come together. The key challenge, of course, is how do we make this happen? And what I would propose is that as we go along, we need to look at opportunities of working together. Now, I will try to put on the thoughts that I had in the form of a presentation. I have no idea if you can see them, but if you can, that's wonderful. You would see a title slide which says biodiversity and climate change, different, but could be the same as well. Can you see that? Can somebody just say yes, Jyoti?
Yes,
Okay,
we
great.
can see it, yes.
Okay. Okay. Now, both biodiversity and climate change tell us that the world is a holistic system and we need to work together with nature in the kinds of things that we do. Obviously, economic development, human growth is important, but we need to move with nature rather than against it. This year, as Basil mentioned, has been a very trying year. I would suggest that the COVID pandemic has brought home to us the importance of biodiversity management. More than anything else, it tells all of us and governments that it is important that how we manage biodiversity, how we conserve it, how do we ensure that biodiversity doesn't spill over from one section of society and geography into another is important in how we go ahead. So I think the timing is right in terms of the preparedness of both people and governments to understand that we need to have a framework to look at biodiversity management. I would also suggest that there is an increasing appreciation that climate change greatly impacts biodiversity for a variety of reasons. And if you look at the kinds of impacts that would be there if we look at a global warming future, in which the warming is limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial averages. And in the climate convention, there are two numbers, 1.5 and 2, that form the upper and lower ranges of what we do. It is well recognized that we go above 2 degrees centigrade, that's irreversible climate change. It's also recognized that because of the emissions that are already out there in the atmosphere, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to go to a future which is less than 1.5 degrees centigrade. So it is within this band that we are working. In the Climate Change Convention, there is something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which periodically produces reports on what is happening, the so-called reviews, the assessment reviews. Now, they also did a special report on 1.5 degree future and looked at the kinds of impacts. And if we move towards a 1.5 degree future, if there's anything more than that, we are looking at massive changes, particularly in biodiversity. But even at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we look at a very large impact, whether it is in terms of the species that are there, whether it is in terms of the ice formations that are there, whether it is in terms of what we get out of the oceans. On all of these, climate would have a major impact on the biodiversity that is available. In other words, climate change is going to be a big driver of the biodiversity management that we talk about. So now the point that we all look at is we all recognize that biodiversity management is important. How do we attract various kinds of investments to look at enhancing biodiversity management? And the key challenge that we look at is biodiversity management investments typically tend to be longer term investments. And there is a huge trade-off with other investments which give here and now benefits. So if I can make money today, I and people like me would have a greater political say than those who are saying, if you save the forest, it'll help us not only today, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And this is a tension that is always there. And I think all of us have understood that the answer lies in piggybacking biodiversity management onto projects which have here and now benefits. That's essential if you want to get public investments. For example, having national parks, for example, or having a range of investments which preserve biodiversity rather than have monocultural agricultural fields or developments built on areas which were otherwise the home of a lot of biodiversity. So the challenge of getting public investments is always there, and therefore the answer, as I said, all of us recognize, is that we need to see how we can piggyback one on the other. Now, how do we look at it? Again, this is very, very well known. We are looking at biodiversity being provided through a range of services, provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, supporting services, something that all of you know far better than I can. I obviously know and appreciate them as a user, not so much as an expert on biodiversity. But the point remains that each one of these are important to us and our livelihoods. So in a sense, our way of life has already factored in biodiversity management, and each one of these has a political relevance as well. And I emphasize this because as far as public investments are concerned, we need to ensure that we are looking at issues which have political relevance, here and now political relevance, the piggybacking that I was talking about. So how much money do we get? And as I looked at the literature, we saw that for 2019, we were looking at somewhere in the $124 to $143 billion a year. That's not exactly peanuts. That's a large amount of money. Sure, it could be larger, undoubtedly. But if you look at all of these investments, one of the things that is startling is that there are very few biodiversity projects that are funded, that are done for the sake of biodiversity. And I would argue, I would leave with you the thought that the problem lies in the fact that biodiversity by itself is something that banks, financial institutions find it extremely uncomfortable to do a risk analysis on. The kinds of traditional risk analysis elements that are present in our financial systems are not easily amenable to biodiversity project, and hence raising money from banks, creditworthiness, is an issue that comes up time and again. This is where I believe that climate change comes in. Now, monetization has been done over the years, and your convention has been at the forefront of a range of ways in which biodiversity projects could earn returns, whether it is through payment for ecosystem services, whether it is through access and benefit sharing, something which I believe that your convention has enabled the world the countries of the world to have legislation which enable access and benefit sharing, as well as a forestry-based biodiversity. Now, this is exactly the set of activities that are being addressed in the climate change world under the rubric of so-called nature-based solutions. Because there are obviously solutions which are about technology, which are about putting solar, which are about putting windmills, which are about having industrial processes or electric cars, which don't emit CO2 emissions. But there is a whole range of solutions which are nature-based. And I believe that each of these nature-based solutions also incorporate biodiversity management. And it is this linkage, I believe, that is the future for us. It is also the future as far as raising resources is concerned. Let me walk in the next couple of minutes through examples of each of these three kinds of interventions where nature-based solutions which protect biodiversity have also been used commercially. Now, the first example that I would provide is that of ecosystem services. And I think the classic example is in the country of Bhutan, where a water source is protected by local communities and is paid for by hotels who pay a fee and enable communities to preserve the water source. This has been working. It has been providing resources, and it is already monetized. I believe that by reducing the vulnerability of people to climate change, because water is one of the first resources that is adversely impacted by climate change. So by reducing vulnerability to climate change, by protecting the biodiversity, it is providing jobs and livelihoods as well. And this combination of three benefits has helped create the kind of understanding in the government, in the private sector, to bring together the stakeholders and the financing to make this happen. The second example is about the preservation of a particular tree. And the oil from this tree and the honey can be used for a variety of purposes if you can figure out how to do it. The local communities can figure out how to do it. Again, this is an example of something that is already occurring in the hills of India, where the local state biodiversity board is providing the support that is needed by the biodiversity management committees that have been formed as a part of your mandate for local communities to be able to take advantage of the biodiversity that is there around them. And agreements to provide the companies which take on these soaps and butter, etc., they provide the resources from their royalties based on agreements that are happening. So again, by preserving biodiversity and the growing of trees enables a larger sequestration of carbon, and there are local livelihoods as well. And again, it is these three things combined which enabled the project to take off. The third is actually, in the climate change world, it's a better known example, but again, it is about forests. And within forests, there is a forest, the example that I'm talking about is in the climate change world, it's called an AR, afforestation, reforestation, CDM, Carbon Development Mechanism project that is being implemented. And here the goal is that the local communities help in the preservation of wildlife. They help in the preservation of trees. And this is quantified in terms of the carbon that is saved, and the carbon credits are then monitored and sold. Monies have already started flowing, and in the process, this ecosystem, which is a very rich ecosystem in terms of biodiversity, is also preserved. I would argue that this kind, again, of a bundling of offsets which provide carbon value of the biodiversity and of benefits that are then provided to the local communities helps in bringing this together. I would like to end by suggesting that for public investments, local here and now benefits are essential. I would also suggest that piggybacking climate change benefits helps, and particularly in the form of nature-based solutions, helps in enhancing the credit worthiness of projects. So these projects which I talked about, two of them at least are funded by financial institutions on credit because based on the returns that are obtained, those loans are paid off. But you will note that the private sector is involved in all of them. All of them involve the private sector providing resources because they are benefiting as well. I would therefore leave you with the thought that financial bundling of biodiversity and carbon benefits, together with local livelihoods, creates the kinds of projects which pull in government money, which pull in philanthropic money, and which also pull in private money. I believe that with this bundling, we can see an order of magnitude increase in the funding that is flowing into biodiversity projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Indeed, some very, very important question you put on the floor. I would like now to give the floor to our second expert, Charles Barber. Charles, or Chip, is the director of the Forest Legality Initiative and a senior biodiversity advisor at the World Resource Institute. Mr. Barber, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, all of you distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. First, I'd like to thank the CBD Secretariat and the co-chairs for giving me this opportunity to speak today on this important topic. Following Dr. Mathur's inspirational big picture presentation, I've been asked to focus on the challenge of building better linkages and synergies between the CBD and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its processes. I don't have any slides, so you'll just have to look at my basement on the screen. Well, for my part, participating in the 1992 Earth Summit was a formative experience. It strengthened my resolve to spend my career fighting for the global environment and promoting multilateral solutions to that end. It was at the Rio Summit that both conventions were open for signature. In those days, the Cold War had recently ended, and there was a sense of optimism and perhaps we all really could work together to address the looming global challenges, both climate change and biodiversity loss. Maybe I was just younger and more idealistic. In any case, nearly 30 years later, we face a decade that the scientists tell us is really our last chance to make good on the promises of Rio and realize the potential of those agreements. We all know the predicament we are in and how history and future generations will judge us if we fail to step up. Whether one looks to the warnings from IPBES, IPCC, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, or many other ominous recent reports, we will not be able to say, sorry, we didn't know. We'll have to say, we knew, but we just couldn't get our act together to take action. I hope that's not the case. I imagine that many of you, like me, listened to President Macron's One Planet Summit yesterday. It's quite interesting. One leader after another yesterday told us that the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss are connected. They told us that the COVID-19 pandemic had its roots in tropical forest loss and the wildlife trade, that humanity and nature are seriously out of balance, and that the entire sustainable development enterprise is under threat. We also heard that many of the solutions to these intertwined problems lie in nature and biodiversity itself, as well as in the wisdom and experience of indigenous peoples and local communities who managed to better maintain the balance of their relationship with nature. So what's next? What can we do? 2020 was anticipated to be an environmental super year, as we all know, and we are indeed at a critical moment as 2021 begins. COVID-19 has postponed the climate and biodiversity summits, but it has not reduced the urgency of addressing our global environmental challenges. Indeed, the pandemic has focused attention on the risks arising from the imbalance in our relationship with nature. and on the fragility of the bonds of globalization. We must step up. They say in crisis we can also find opportunities, and our present economic crisis has given us a chance, if we're bold enough to take it, to build back in ways that at once restore biodiversity, reduce risks of future pandemics, and address the climate change and biodiversity crises. We really must step up. Too often, however, we find biodiversity and climate change dealt with in relative isolation. Despite the grand words of many leaders, the UNFCCC and the CBD generally operate in their own silos and jealously guard their respective turf. That's no longer a path we can afford to follow, I would submit. So what should we do? I'm going to first tell you what I think, but then most importantly pose some questions to all of you to see what you think. Here's what I think are four basic propositions I hope that many of us could agree on. First, nature is under assault. The experts tell us that over 40% of the world's land is now agricultural or urban, with only 23% of the land and just 13% of the ocean still classified as intact ecosystems. Forest, coastal, marine, grassland, and freshwater ecosystems have all been reduced and degraded, and the pressure continues to build. We heard yesterday that 96% of animal biomass on Earth is found in humans and livestock, only 4% in wild animals, which I had not heard before, but it's quite something. Second, conserving nature is critical for achieving our sustainable development agenda. The SDGs, of course, include goals on climate change and biodiversity, but these so-called environmental goals also underpin economic and social goals on poverty, hunger, health, water, and food security. Third, slowing the loss of primary forests and key coastal ecosystems must be our most urgent priorities. Now, all ecosystems are obviously important one way or another, but our remaining primary forests, biodiversity-rich and carbon-dense coastal ecosystems, such as coral reefs and mangroves, are most critical for slowing biodiversity loss and for both climate change mitigation and adaptation. These are also the ecosystems facing the fastest rates of degradation and loss. If we lose these battles, we lose the war. Fourth, COVID-19 has demonstrated the cost of the growing imbalance between people and nature. Many of you will have participated in the very excellent session on this that the CBD held under SBI in December. The zoonotic origin of the pandemic has highlighted the risks of disrupting the equilibrium between human and natural systems. And the impacts on human health and the global economy have been devastating, straining public health and financial systems, and throwing social and economic inequalities into sharp relief. And the progressive destruction of nature, tropical forests in particular, appears to be a significant cause of zoonotic disease outbreaks. So what can we do in the face of such daunting challenges? I believe with many others, and as Dr. Mathur mentioned, that a big part of our collective approach must lie in devising and adopting nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions, or NBS as some call it, can be defined, as they have been by IUCN, as, quote, actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems that at once address societal challenges while providing for human well-being and helping achieve climate and biodiversity goals. So that might be a bit of our bridge. Nature-based solutions come in many varieties, but protecting and strengthening the ecological integrity of natural ecosystems, I believe, must be their guiding principle. By this, I mean that the closer ecosystems are kept to natural patterns of biodiversity distribution and abundance, the higher the stability and quality of the ecosystem services that they provide. Building on this core principle of ecological integrity, effective nature-based solutions need to be employed along three broad dimensions. These will not be unfamiliar to you, I don't think. First, we must protect the most biologically diverse, carbon-dense natural ecosystems through legal designation and effective management of protected areas, including recognition of the territories, access rights, and conservation efforts of indigenous peoples and local communities, and mobilize new funding to support their efforts. Second, we must restore the ecological integrity and economic productivity of degraded lands and ecosystems via a range of landscape restoration measures. Third, we need to connect, or in some cases reconnect, natural ecosystems to each other across land and seascapes in ways that maximize complementarities across climate, biodiversity, and sustainable development goals. Now comes the tricky part. Assuming you more or less agree with at least some of what I've said so far, what could the CBD and the Climate Convention do during 2021 to come closer together in addressing these challenges and realizing a more sustainable future? I'll start with the Climate Convention and COP26. Excuse me. In terms of guiding principles, I think COP26 needs to do four things. First, the parties need to reinforce and build on the COP25 decision 1/CP.25, which noted really for the first time, I think, in the climate change that quote, the Climate Change Convention that quote, the essential contribution of nature to addressing climate change and its impacts, and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner. It's there, but it hasn't really been unpacked yet. So COP26 needs to reaffirm, strengthen, and operationalize this important principle. Nature matters for the climate. That needs to be recognized. Second, COP26 should recognize the functional role of biodiversity in maintaining ecosystem integrity and stability as a key principle for the UNFCCC operational rules on land use in forests. Forests, as I think you all know, are much more than just trees, and trees themselves are not just sticks of carbon. They're complex ecosystems. Third, it would be good for COP26 to explicitly recognize the importance of conserving, restoring, and connecting the most carbon-dense ecosystems, including primary forests, peatlands, mangroves, seagrasses, and tidal salt marshes, large or small, as key foundations for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Fourth, COP26 should welcome and further develop what are known in that convention as alternative policy approaches that link climate mitigation and adaptation via landscape scale approaches that encompass climate, biodiversity, and socioeconomic benefits. We need to get out of our silos. To do this, there are three steps that will have to be done on particular rules and processes which are holding all of that back. First, COP26 and the convention need to recognize carbon stock accounts for land and forest ecosystems, in addition to the current focus on carbon flows and fluxes, building on the ongoing work on this topic being carried out by the UN system of environmental and economic accounts. Second, the COP26 should establish a post-COP intersessional mechanism that could take forward technical and policy work on nature-based solutions, either under the substa or through constitution of an ad hoc working or technical group. And finally, COP26 should propose, in consultation with the CBD, a process to enhance and facilitate cooperation between the two conventions on joint or coordinated action on developing and scaling nature-based solutions that address both the climate and biodiversity crises. So on to the main event for today and my last set of points. What should CBD COP15 do to unite the struggles to conserve biodiversity and to combat climate change? Co-chairs have rightly reminded us we're not here to negotiate. So just think of the following ideas as observations by an observer, which is what I am at the CBD, on what the CBD might do to help build bridges between the climate and biodiversity agendas. In thinking about the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, there's 6 elements that I think need to be in there. First, there needs to be an explicit recognition of the centrality of conserving and restoring ecosystem integrity for biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the prevention of future zoonotic pandemics. And I have to say that the present draft language on that is really wholly inadequate. It's very vague. I think we can do better. Second, we need a no-loss goal for the most carbon-dense, high biodiversity ecosystems with specific targets and timelines, including explicit attention to primary forests, peatlands, mangroves, coral reefs, and other coastal ecosystems for the reasons that I mentioned previously. The simple fact is that some ecosystems cannot be replaced or restored. They can only be protected or they will be irrevocably lost. Third, we need a goal to protect at least 30% of Earth's terrestrial and marine surfaces in protected areas and other effective conservation measures by 2030, with associated targets, including specific attention to the most carbon-dense, high biodiversity ecosystems, as I noted above. This is the 30 by 30 goal that we heard a lot about yesterday in the One Planet Summit and seems to be gaining some credibility. Fourth, we must have a goal that explicitly recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities and the importance of supporting their territories and conserved areas as an integral part of the framework and strategy. Fifth, we need an ecosystem restoration goal focused in large part on rebuilding ecosystem integrity, including building resilience to reduce risk of future zoonotic pandemics. Planting trees is great, but restoration is not just about planting trees. Finally, we must have a goal and associated targets on mobilizing new and expanded finance and other means of implementation to mobilize nature-based solutions. We saw some good commitments in that direction yesterday from both the public and private sectors, but we're going to need a lot more to really seal the deal. Now, all this in the Global Biodiversity Framework will not be self-executing, so there'll be a need for some supporting decisions, it seems, and I can think of three things those decisions should focus on. First, the COP needs to recognize the importance of nature-based solutions for both climate change mitigation and adaptation, and affirm the role of the CBD in addressing climate change challenges, and take a leading role in promoting nature-based solutions to address those challenges. Second, the COP should establish an intersessional ad hoc working group or other process to address development and application of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as for reducing the risks of future zoonotic pandemics, such as COVID-19. Third and finally, COP15 should propose, in consultation with the UNFCCC, a process and institutional mechanism to enhance and facilitate cooperation between the two processes on joint or coordinated action on developing and scaling nature-based solutions that at once address the biodiversity and climate crisis, which, as I mentioned, is something that the Framework Convention on Climate Change also needs to do. So that's what I think needs to be done. But more importantly, what do you think? That's what everyone really wants to hear. So let me leave you then with four potential questions for your views and discussion. So first, do you agree in principle that efforts to combat and adapt to climate change through the UNFCCC and efforts to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity through the CBD do need to be more closely integrated and coordinated? Maybe you don't. Second, assuming you do, what are the key barriers that you see, whether they be practical, political, diplomatic, or economic, that you see to strengthening the cooperation and synergies between two conventions and their goals? Third, for those of you who may oppose more robust attention to climate change in the CBD context, you know who you are, and you haven't been shy about expressing that. Can you help us understand the reasons for those objections so maybe we can find a way forward? And finally, what concrete steps could the parties at COP15 and at COP26 take to realize the potential mutual synergies which could arise? I look forward to hearing all of your views and to discussing these issues in person as soon as that is possible. In the meantime, I wish you and your families good health, and I once again thank the co-chairs and the Secretariat for giving me the chance to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, for your presentation. You're leaving us with some really important and heavy questions, and I'm looking forward to hear the participants' response. Now I will ask Ms. Ajay Mathur from the Secretariat to help us moderate the discussion. Jyoti, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Basil. Thanks a lot, Francis and Charles and Dr. Mathur, for your great setting the scene for this particular webinar. And I must congratulate you all that you kept to time. It's the first time I've done a webinar where I'm actually starting the discussion at the right time. I mean, we have now 1 hour, 20 minutes for discussions. I hope we will be able to get a lot of views in. So this is something new that we're trying to do. As you heard both Basil and Francis say, we are going to try and get both the parties and the non-party parties and stakeholders to get equal voice and equal opportunity to speak. We also have It's a mixed bag because we are using the question box for questions, as well as we would like you to, if you would like to speak, we would like you to put your name and maybe your association so that I am able to call upon you. And we also have some questions already in the box. So if any of the panelists would like to respond to those questions already, I would be very grateful. If not, I'll bring some of them into the discussion. But I would like really as many people who are able to speak to have an opportunity to do so. We can keep going back to the panels as and when it, you know, after a few questions and comments. However, we really want this to be a discussion amongst you. So amongst the participants, and we have a large number of people that have signed in. So we'll try to do this. It's a mixed bag, and I apologize in advance if I mess up and leave out people, but I will try as much as I can possibly do. For those participants that are joining us through the through YouTube live stream of Facebook, and you have comments or questions, please send them to us via email at live@cbd.int, so that we are with your name and country or organization, so that we are able to also read these out to you, read these out. So if you wish to take the floor, please put your name and association, so either party or organization or country or whatever in the question box, and I will call you, and we are going to try and take one non-party, one stakeholder and one party alternately. And if there are no parties requesting the floor, then we'll go directly to the list of speakers in order. So the floor is open. Please go ahead and request the floor, and the mic will be given to you then. Thanks a lot. Now I have to go to the questions and see if there's anyone that's asked for the floor as yet. So far, I don't see anyone that's asked for the floor. I have lots of questions, so maybe I could start with some of the questions. There is a question from Cameron Pliers. For farmers around the world, can certification serve as an entry point or foundation to build upon to ensure that the growth of commodities like coffee, cocoa, palm oil, paper, beef, etc., have a framework to contribute to the protection of biodiversity and climate change prevention? Then we have how to ensure that the negotiations at the international level for CBD and the Cartagena Protocol are not so asymmetrical between developed and developing countries. I'm just reading them out in order, but now I see some people are asking for the floor. Masha Kalinina, apologies if I don't pronounce it, is requesting the floor on behalf of the Pew Charitable Trust and 6 other major international organizations. Masha, you have the floor. Masha? Joyce, can you give the floor to Masha, please? Can you give her the mic?
And can folks hear me?
Hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Testing. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. So this statement is on behalf of Pew, CI, NRDC, MCI, WCS, Ocean Unite, and IFA, all supportive of protecting and conserving at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. More than 70 countries now endorse this target as part of the global goal to sustainably manage 100% of the ocean. Most of these countries are members of the High Ambition Coalition led by Costa Rica and France, the Global Ocean Alliance led by the UK, the High Level Ocean Panel led by Norway and Palau, and or the Blue Leaders led by Belgium. The best available science tells us that we need to expand area-based conservation efforts in the ocean to conserve biodiversity and ecosystems, improve long-term food security, and protect ocean-based livelihoods. For nature to deliver maximum benefits, these areas must be free from harmful or industrial extraction or activities. And we call on countries to ensure at least this level of protection in the 30 by 30 target. And increasingly, ocean-based solutions to climate change, including the creation of effective marine protected areas, are seen as an important part of addressing the climate crisis. Ultimately, safeguarding our ocean ecosystems is good for communities, fishers, climate, and biodiversity. 30% cannot be reached without respect for the rights of indigenous people and local communities, their leadership, and free prior and informed consent. According to the Rapa Nui community leader, Ludovic Burns-Tukey, the creation of a large marine protected area around Easter Island helped the Rapa Nui progress toward the recognition of their ancestral rights and vision for the environment. Mr. Burns-Tukey leads the community group Te Mau o Te Waikawa, which has officially endorsed the global 30% ocean target. A significant financial commitment will be needed to reach the global goal of protecting and conserving at least 30% of the ocean. Countries like the UK, Germany, and Costa Rica have already established funding mechanisms that advance 30 by 30 domestically and abroad. With additional government commitments and together with the private sector funding and the elimination of harmful fisheries, we can ensure we successfully meet this target. A recent report tells us that each dollar invested in ocean conservation delivers 5 times its value in benefits. And to close, in the words of Mr. Burns-Tukey, we need more humility as humans and to give nature the respect it deserves. So we guarantee the future of the next generation, and this future begins now. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Masha. I will now, there aren't many people asking for the floor, but I see a lot of questions. So I will give the floor to Helena Paul now, and then maybe we can go back to the panel if they would like to go to respond to some of the questions in the question box. Helena, please, you have the floor. Helena?
Great. Hello. Sorry, it took me a moment to unmute. Hello. Thank you very much. What worries many of us is in the question of more collaboration between the UNFCCC and the CBD, it's this. Is the intention to exploit biodiversity for offsets, payments for ecosystem services, etc., in the interests of enabling corporations to continue with climate forcing emissions? Because this is how it looks to many of us. What we feel is really necessary, rather than relying on comparatively weak ideas like offsets, payment for ecosystem services, and nature-based solutions generally, is to actually change the systems that we're using. There was already a reference to the unwillingness of banks to make long-term investments in nature. And of course, this is part of the way they act. But many of us believe that we have to change the underlying system, reform those banks, and actually tackle the whole idea of everything being based on economic growth. I know that's a huge question, but it's a question that arises from the proposal to have more collaboration between the UNFCCC and the CBD. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Helena. I will now give the floor to Katie Beckett from the UK to speak, and then Lina Barrera, after which I will go back to the panel. Thanks a lot. Katie?
I make this statement on behalf of the UK. This year provides an exceptional opportunity to strengthen the linkages in both policy and implementation between the Rio Conventions, noting that key strategic decisions will be made in all 3 COPs this year. It is clear that we need integrated solutions that address climate change and biodiversity loss challenges in tandem. By making nature a key focus of COP26, we hope to demonstrate that nature-based solutions can deliver multiple benefits and therefore play a critical role in strengthening the links between both and achieving mutually reinforcing outcomes at both COPs. At the One Planet Summit on the 11th of January, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom announced that the UK will commit to spending at least $3 billion over 5 years of our international climate finance on climate change solutions that protect and restore nature and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Lena, I think we also have Sarah Ruffner who wants to speak, but first I'll go to Lena, then I'll go back to the panel, then we'll come back to Sarah Ruffner and Colombia. So Lena, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jyoti. I'm speaking on behalf of BirdLife International, Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Scientists have identified and quantified 20 nature-based solutions for climate that work by either increasing carbon storage and/or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions through conservation, restoration, and improved management in high-carbon ecosystems. Collectively, these solutions can provide 37% of the cost-effective mitigation needed by 2030 to hold warming to below 2 degrees. Essential to this is the continued storage of irrecoverable carbon, the carbon stored in the Earth's biomass and soils that would be impossible to recover by 2050 if emitted due to land use change. Much of this irrecoverable carbon is in the highly intact areas of nature around the world that are also important habitat for many species. Nature also has a critical role in supporting adaptation for both humans and species and for reducing risk from disasters. Further, reinforcing connectivity of natural areas will secure important safety zones for species as their traditional habitats shift due to climatic changes. When it comes to building better linkages between the CBD and the UNFCCC, we recommend focusing on the implementation of actions that support both climate and biodiversity outcomes. This requires spatial planning to identify the right places to prioritize for multiple benefits and joint implementation plans for climate and biodiversity, strengthening the NBSAPs and the NDCs, and unlocking new financing for biodiversity. Given all of this, we include the following recommendations for party as they finalize the Global Biodiversity Framework. First, we recommend exclusively using the term nature-based solutions throughout the text and adopting the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. For Target 7, we recommend retaining the 3 aspects of the target, focusing on nature's role on mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. We recommend amending the target to ensure that nature-based solutions for climate change are designed to avoid negative impacts on both biodiversity and people. We recommend adding specific quantitative commitments to the target to make it SMART, and ensuring that the monitoring framework or the implementation framework evaluates the maximization of potential for nature-based solutions in NBSAPs. And for Target 2 on conservation and protection, we recommend including areas critical for climate action under the target. In close, we would like to emphasize that a strong agreement relies on ensuring that nature's role in helping to maintain a stable climate and adapting to the impacts of climate change, including reducing risk from disasters, is clearly articulated in the goals, targets, and monitoring components of the framework. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lena. I will now see if anyone on the panel would like to respond to some of the excellent discussion points that have come up. But while you are, while you respond, there is another very good question by Henry McGee in the question box. The SDGs aim to tackle challenges together. How can they be mainstreamed to help address the challenges of climate change, biodiversity, and other challenges together, and inviting mass participation across all sectors? So most of you are working with the SDGs in your countries, so maybe you can put a little bit of context on that too. Charles, you first, and then we will see who else wants to go.
Sure. Just Thanks very much. Just taking these on very quickly. This question of soft commodities and their certification and how that can help with both climate biodiversity, that's a very good point. I think a lot of us will know that a lot of the drivers of deforestation, particularly in tropical areas, coming from the production of various kinds of agricultural commodities, beef, soy, palm oil, etc. And processes of certification in other ways are improving the performance and due diligence and reducing the environmental footprint of those kinds of agricultural value chains, is obviously very important. So yes, I think that's an important area. I don't think it's something that the conventions themselves probably should be messing around in, but it's out there as a tool. On asymmetrical negotiations between North and South, this is a problem across all sort of multilateral processes. I think it requires resources, capacity building, and where you can find it, North-South cooperation, triangular cooperation, as ways to strengthen the voices of those who don't have as much of a voice or as much in the way of technical capacity as some others. On Masha's point, it's a great point on the oceans. And thank you for raising this issue of Rapa Nui, which we heard yesterday in the One Planet Summit, that big protected areas are needed, obviously, in some areas, but locally managed marine areas are also extremely important. And we need a balance of those two things. Helena raised a really good point, and this gets to the part that I remember seeing stickers in Rome the last time we were all together in the same place. I still have one here that says, "Our nature is not your solution." The idea being that there is, a hidden agenda, that there is a hidden agenda of corporate takeover and commodification of natural resources and getting industrialized sectors in more industrialized countries off the hook and transferring that burden to tropical developing countries, local communities. That's a serious concern, obviously, of both some governments and a lot of people in civil society. So it needs to be specifically discussed and taken on. That said, we do want to find ways that we can channel corporate investment, banking, and all that into more productive directions for both climate and biodiversity. I'm not sure that, although I certainly support a lot of system change, I'm not sure that you come to a place like a multilateral United Nations-based convention for fundamental system change. I think there are lots of other ways to do that this goes to the point about the SDGs, in terms of mass political mobilization and actually changing things in a big way. I live in downtown Washington, D.C., right downtown. So we're going through some things like that right now, as you probably know. And these are things that are not going to be solved through international agreements. They're going to have to be solved by citizens actually saying what they want and moving forward on that and getting accountability from their elected officials and others. For the UK, I'd say, yes, that was great yesterday. The UK really stepped up and said some good things and is planning some good things, £3 billion into the nature side of climate finance. We hope other countries will also step up in that direction. So well done. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Chip. Now, Dr. Mathur, before I turn to you, there are a couple of questions directly related to your presentation. One of them by Beth Kaplan is biodiversity projects that make the cut. It will be helpful to operationalize what are the parameters for a project to make the cut. So maybe, is there a way that we could be looking at this? I don't think you can tell us how immediately right now, but maybe there could be a way that we could look at this. And there was something from Mark Johnson that made a little bit of, which is an interesting question. Do you think there could be a market for biodiversity credits, similar to carbon credits and carbon trading? Thanks. Over to you. Unmute. Can't hear you.
There I am. Okay, now
Yeah.
you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is an extremely stimulating discussion. And there are 2 points that I want to make, which are general points, and then I'll come to the specifics that have been discussed. The first is we are all in this, in a sense, together. Yes, there are various negotiating points, whether it's developing countries, whether it is doing it on the basis of corporate interests or community interests. The thing is, all of us are here together. And what we need to do is to find the kinds of coalitions that work for everyone. And it's not going to be one answer that will provide everything. There'll be multiple answers. Okay. So having said these generic points, how do we look at some of the specific questions that have been made? The issue of certification. As Tip said, as has been asked, certification makes great sense. Whether it is for the creation of biodiversity credits, or whether it is for the certification of the products, whether it is food, whether it is commodities. See, in the Climate Change Convention, the carbon credits that were created, my country, India, a huge number of people invested in creating credits in things like wind and energy efficiency and so on. Most of those credits lie unsold. But what it did was to create a lobby within the country for monetizing carbon. I would suggest that it is much more important to create the users of the biodiversity credits as important as it is to create the biodiversity credits themselves. Because if you don't have buyers, it's horrible. When people have invested, they've invested in creating the project, they've invested in creating the biodiversity credits, and then there's nobody to buy them. I think having large buyers who will buy certified products is the first step in creating the kinds of coalitions that bring together communities on one side and buyers, large buyers on the other. This also addressed the issue of offsets. Now, offsets is an issue as long as the change that you want is small. But once the change is large, offsets won't work. Each country will have to invest in preserving the kind of biodiversity that it wants. So in the climate change world, we created the offsets. There are carbon credits. Carbon credits today, countries are, the Climate Change Convention has not been able to agree to rules regarding the transfer of credits from one country to another in the next period, the Paris Agreement period, for the very simple reason, every country now has a goal. And India, for example, transfers some credits today from India to another country. And come 2030, when all the inventory is made, it is found that India is short by a certain amount, and they say, oh my God, why did we transfer it? If we didn't transfer it, we would have this. So offsets are an issue as far as long-term development is concerned. But I would argue that they are important as far as creating awareness and creating a lobby for change. And I don't mean lobby in a bad word, I mean lobby in the sense that now there's a lobby for biodiversity, just as there was a lobby for carbon. The last question that I wanted to address related to changing paradigms. One of the things that we have noticed is that we do move towards changing paradigms. It's a difficult process. It's a process in which there is a lot of pushback. But the paradigm occurs when you are facing ruin. As I mentioned, we are looking now at a world which can't be below 1.5 degrees centigrade warming because of the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And the world, if it is above 2 degrees, there's irreversible harm. It's a very narrow range, 1.5 to 2 degrees. That's where we have to live. That's woken the world up. My view is we are now, at least in the climate world, in a paradigm, in a shifted paradigm, where every country in the world is looking at ways in which we could move to lower and ultimately zero carbon options across the board. And I think it took this kind of a catastrophe to convert the climate. I hope the world wakes up sooner as far as biodiversity conservation is concerned. I would have liked to answer the question on SDGs, but I actually don't know how. We have not been able to find any model which brings together work on different SDGs together at the country level.
Thanks a lot. I will now give the floor to Sarah Rosner, Director of Environmental Research and Engagement at Alliance Bernstein, and then to Melissa Levert from Colombia. Thanks a lot. Sarah, you have the floor. Joyce?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So Alliance Bernstein is an asset manager based in New York with more than $650 billion in assets under management across asset classes, sectors, and regions across the globe. We would appreciate the panelists' perspective on the role of non-government, non-multilateral financial institutions in realizing these ambitions and goals that are so imperative at this point. We would encourage the convention to more actively include non-government, non-multilateral financial firms such as ourselves, which have reach into all of these sectors and the governments through our investments, in the discussions to consider more closely the role of financial services firms in biodiversity preservation and how that can and will be expected to evolve.
Thanks a lot. Before I go to Colombia, I just want to remind everybody that whoever wants to speak, instead of typing your question in, maybe you would like to directly address them to all of us. So if anyone else wants to speak after Colombia, please type your name in to the question box and I will call on you. Otherwise, I'll read out as many questions as I can before going back to the panel. Please, Colombia, you have the floor. Melissa.
Thank you, Jyoti. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm speaking on behalf of Colombia. We see the Post-2020 framework as an opportunity to bring the UNFCCC and the CBD closer. We need this to happen in order to tackle the current planetary crisis, which is our common goal. We also think that the targets in the framework must address the 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss identified by the IPBES, including, of course, climate change. On the other hand, there are several opportunities to contribute to the climate crisis through biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. Therefore, we consider that the post-2020 targets must be multi-purpose to address biodiversity loss, climate change, and the SDGs. We cannot keep looking at these issues as silos. The biodiversity and climate change agendas have in common the need to promote sustainable patterns of production and consumption by addressing land conversion, deforestation, the efficient use of water resources, sustainable food systems, and efficient cattle ranching at the landscape scale, among others. In the same line, it is equally relevant to align climate finance with biodiversity finance to generate a critical mass of resources that promotes the implementation of the required actions to achieve our common goals. In order to strengthen the linkages between climate change and biodiversity, we consider that there is the need to promote under the CBD a better understanding of the nature-based solutions concept. We believe that nature-based solutions provide the opportunity to efficiently integrate the climate, biodiversity, and disaster risk reduction agendas under a holistic and coherent approach. In addition, we think that nature-based solutions and the ecosystem-based approach don't exclude each other. These are correlated concepts which could be addressed together as complementary tools in biodiversity management. Therefore, we could explore options for including this concept under the Post-2020 framework. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Melissa, and we are so looking forward to coming to Colombia for the third meeting of the open-ended working group this year, definitely this year. Thank you. I will now ask Dr. Per Sjögren-Gulver from Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm sure I mispronounced your name, so please forgive me for that, but you have the floor now, followed by Christine Akello from Uganda. So we're not exactly keeping to our one party, one stakeholder commitment, but we are getting as many people as we as are requesting the floor. So Per, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Jyoti. I hope I pronounce your name correct too. I work as a principal research officer at the Swedish EPA, and so Sweden has been a country and party of the convention that has stressed the importance of genetic variability for species and ecosystems to be able to adapt to climate change. And what I also wanted to emphasize, I mentioned this and I gave some links to publications, policy briefs, and papers dealing with this. And we've had a series of, not my agency, but another network of cooperation in science and technology, had webinars with CBD people from various continents, and from that, there seemed that there are some countries that are interested in testing a set of proposed indicators for genetic diversity, which came in the journal Biological Conservation in July last year. But what I want to really say here, I think that there is a kind of win-win situation between kind of an international collaboration with respect to, I mean, which can benefit the biodiversity conservation, that can benefit the education, because as you work, and especially if there is a collaboration between scientists that are interested in biodiversity conservation and the managers and the policymakers, I think that the kind of knowledge transfer from science to the practical restoration and conservation of biodiversity will really increase. I will illustrate this just by another one, which is the Nobel Prize for Scientific Findings, which the Swedish Nobel Committee was actually this year to one case of nature-based solution, and that is this genetic scissors, which is actually the CRISPR-Cas9. It's actually collected from bacteria, so it already existed in nature, and it's just one additional example of how there are so many good things in nature that we can make good use of. But I think really that what I want to emphasize is for increased implementation and for really doing to kind of have the knowledge transfer from scientific methods and science into the practical management and restoration. I would really stress the factor of collaborative learning together with scientists. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Per. I will now ask Christine from Uganda. Then I will read out a few questions and go back to the panelists, and then we can have a final round of interventions. Christine, please.
Thank you very much, Jyoti. I'd like to read a short statement from Uganda. Biodiversity and climate change interventions complement each other. Protection of ecosystems and natural habitats, as well as restoration of degraded ecosystems, not only contribute to biodiversity conservation, but are also important contributors to reversing climate change. Hence, enhancing climate resilience and adaptive capacity of ecosystems and human community is imperative. Global action should be focused to improving the health and resilience of ecosystems, which is fundamental to ensuring that ecosystems are able to perform their function of climate regulation while providing a wider range of ecosystem services that are essential for human well-being. Enhanced adaptive capacity of ecosystems to climate change contributes to sustainable development at the country level by way of food security, household and national incomes, healthy well-being, access to clean and safe water, and overall socio-economic development. In Uganda, the ecosystem life support areas, including forests, wetlands, water resources, and wildlife, contribute to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goal targets by sectors like agriculture, health, tourism, water, and industry. The agricultural sector of Uganda, for example, is highly nature dependent, using a range of ecosystems and climate resources. The sector accounts for about 21.92% of the gross domestic product and 36% of the employment sector. On its own, the sector employs 65% of the working population in Uganda. Uganda's nationally determined contributions and long-term low emission development strategy are being revised to reflect the significant contribution of biodiversity and ecosystems to climate adaptation and mitigation. It is therefore important that actions on nature-based solutions for biodiversity and climate change are prioritized in the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Biodiversity and climate change goals are aligned with development goals. Resource mobilization and allocation for biodiversity is brought to the same level as for climate action. Financing at the global and national level is designed to bring about the desired transformative change. Capacity building and technology transfer are equally supported. Implementation of NBSAPs, nationally determined contributions, and protection of natural habitats is supported. And finally, that implementation of biodiversity and climate change programs is synergized. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christine. I just want to remind everyone that please ask for the floor through the question box and not through the hand in the attendees list because we want to know your association. So I am going to now read out a few questions and then go back to Chip and Dr. Mathur to see if they want to give a final round of comments, and then we can go back to some more of your interventions, and then I will pass it to the co-chairs to close. Thank you so much. So we have a question from Beth Kaplan, and I think this is related to the presentation earlier. The three monetization mechanisms seem very much based on traditional economic model, and how do you try to fit biodiversity into this? Nigel Windsor, thank you, Dr. Mathur and Mr. Barber, for your excellent summaries. My question to Mr. Barber on the question of stepping up. How can the farming community today step up to monitor their contributions to both CBD and FCCC goals? Then we have Flora Luna Gonzalez asking how to avoid that some countries do not cooperate in proposed plans to preserve biodiversity and remain at risk of new pests. Can you share the six, Chip, can you share the six recommendations? If you do, we'll put it on our website because there are quite a few questions for that. I have one very interesting one on GDP from David Calvert. GDP is so dominant and is a flow-based tool, but what opportunities are there to use stock-based tools to change people's perspectives on what economic success could come to mean? For example, from stewardship of the global commons within world balance sheets, including in all the world's natural capital. So I will give the floor back. Dr. Mathur, you want to start?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the main question that I wanted to address was, how do we make the cut? I think Bess had asked the question. It's a question that I think has an answer that is still being found. So let me share. First of all, there is a range of nature-based solutions which are out there. At the Climate Action Summit, which the UN Secretary General had carried out last year, the co-chairs of the nature-based solution group, China and New Zealand, had presented a compendium of solutions, which I think makes very interesting reading, because it talks of the wide variety of both initiatives and coalitions that are developed. But what I'd like to do is to focus on two of the three examples that I give. The key issue is, are the people who are developing the project getting a financial return on the basis of which they can repay the loan that they have got from a government, from a bank? That's the cut as far as financing from a bank is concerned. The second is, when you are doing a project, are the beneficiaries getting a development benefit which is in line with the government's or the society's goal for the betterment of the lives of people? That's the cut for public investment. Now, the numerical answers to these are not possible because they obviously vary from country to country. They also vary from project to project. But I think the short answer is that the here and now benefits, for example, the one that we spoke about as far as the ecosystem in the ecosystem services which was there in Bhutan was concerned, was really about seeing how you brought in the preservation of biodiversity in a water-rich, in a region where water flows otherwise, so holding that water, and for people to pay for it. Now, yes, it can be argued that this is not the best example. These are things that should be happening anyway, or that public investment should be used for doing. But I think the truth of the matter is that in countries where resources for investment in development are stretched, you're looking at raising money from every source that you can look at. And I think this is an example of how you build on these kinds of benefits that you get. The second example that I wanted to take was the afforestation example. Yes, again, it can be argued that this looks at offsets, but the issue is that it creates livelihoods to people who get some additional money in addition to what they get out of selling forest produce. What it does is helps them preserve the forest sustainably. The amount of forest produce that they take out and sell is in sustainable numbers, and this is the additional money that is coming because they're selling sustainably. The carbon is maintained and increased and earns these carbon credits. That, because of that, there is a flow of money. So as I said when I began, this is a work in progress. We don't know where it will go tomorrow, but clearly what we are beginning to see is that both within public investment and private investment, we are beginning to see the beginnings of a methodology, of a framework. It's not even a methodology, of a framework within which investment for biodiversity conservation is occurring when you are also seeing here and now benefits.
Thanks a lot, Chip.
Thanks very much. Before I give a couple brief responses to the very excellent interventions and things, I've gotten a couple email inquiries, both and through you, about the text of what I was saying, and I will provide that if you can post it somewhere. I just need to clean it up a tiny bit, but I'll provide it right after this is done. And I should mention that all those ideas come out of a report that I worked on with a number of other colleagues. It recently came out. It's called the Nexus Report, Nature-Based Solutions to the Biodiversity and Climate Crisis. I'll make that available as well. That was co-sponsored by the WEIS Campaign for Nature, who some of you will know, and the F20 Foundations Platform, and the C Foundation, which is based in China. And thanks to them, they really supported us in doing that. That's got more detail than you'd ever want on all of this, and I'll make it available. It's available online, and I'll make my comments available as well. The point that Sarah made on private sector investment, that should catch your attention. $650 billion in assets. We were quite excited by people talking about $1 billion, $5 billion on the One Planet Summit. If we could redirect that kind of money towards things that would help climate and biodiversity, it would be really helpful. The problem with the conventions is there's a model, and I say this as someone who was a negotiator for the US and a lot of these things for 9 years. There's a model in people's heads that basically government representatives come together in a multilateral process, and national government representatives are the people who really count and who can make decisions, and that somehow things are agreed and those people go back to their countries and then things magically happen. But we know that's not how the real world works. And so this is a really good effort. This event today is trying to bring together some of the voices and the power of civil society and farmers and the private sector. It's hard to change in the multilateral setting, but I think it is beginning to move a little bit in that direction. The distinguished delegate from Colombia's statement, and just say, I agree. I think that was a great statement, and I hope that it can be the basis of things going forward, and look forward to that. Our Swedish colleague from the Environmental Protection Agency office there, yeah, this is a big problem. Turning science into policy. It's key. We've had a lot of science that's come out in the last couple of years that tells us what we need to know, but turning that into policy, getting to the politics and the economics is not automatic. It's not a build it and they will come kind of a thing. At World Resources Institute, we've learned this the hard way. You can produce lots of good data and insights, but if you can't make it, if you don't meet the policymakers and managers where they are, it's very hard to make it happen. Our motto is basically count it, change it, and scale it. And you have to go through those steps to really make something work. But that requires a lot of political support and money, not just data and information and science. Farmers, I would say, someone said in one of these meetings, some people come here to make commitments. Other people come here to make demands. I'm not interested in making any commitments. I'm here to make some demands. And I think that that's what we really need to hear from sectors like farmers and fisherfolk and indigenous and local communities. So I would say just come and speak and be heard. That's very, very important. Uganda's statement, also very good. I thought that was good. And finally, this question of GDP, and can we replace it? Well, that's a little bit what's been going on in this UN office on systems of national accounts and things like this. People have put forward a lot of good ideas for a long time. In Bhutan, the gross national happiness idea, it has been around for a long time. It's really difficult to change because GDP is simple to count and it's got a lot of momentum, even though we know it's not right. So I think we just have to keep on trying on that. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Chip. So I'm going to go back to some comments and interventions from the participants. I'm a little confused because some people are asking for the floor to the question box, but there are some green. Some people are highlighted green in the attendee list. So I'm trying to put this together, and with great support from Basil. So I will call out the people that we think are asking for the floor. And if you're not, then please just say you don't want the floor, but we'll give this is the list that I seem to have. Jessica Bridgers from the World Animal Net, Sylvia Ribeiro from the ETC Group, Mohammed Bashir Yusuf from the Nigeria Gibbon Africa region, the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, Oscar Guevara from WWF, Sue Campbell, Scotland, Kim Friedman, FAO, Evelyn Vera Barreto, Government of Mexico, and Hiroki Tomoe, Government of Japan. So I will give the floor to Jessica Bridgers next, World Animal Net. Thanks.
Thank you. Our current agricultural systems, which are highly industrialized, are a significant driver of climate change and a major driver of biodiversity loss. This seems to be a sector where there could be real scope for collaboration between the conventions. So my question is, what actions can the COPs and the Global Biodiversity Framework take to transform agricultural systems towards production and consumption patterns that are more climate and biodiversity friendly? And in particular, how can we encourage financing for agriculture that achieves this transformation and discourages financing for agricultural systems and products that contribute to climate change, biodiversity loss, and zoonotic risk? Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. Should we go to Sylvia Ribeiro, please? ETC Group. Sylvia?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't. I had some problems activating. Thank you very much. I am from ETC Group, which is a small international NGO. We are part of the CBD Alliance, and I would like to make a few comments. One is that in the beginning it was said that about 60 to 75% of the zoonotic these emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, but the majority of that is not wildlife. The majority of that is livestock, is industrial production. So industrial production of livestock and agriculture, as said by the former speaker, is a major driver of climate change and also the most important destruction of biodiversity, because most of the agriculture, most of the deforestation is due to the expansion of industrial agriculture, so which is done for fodder. So the CBD has to take the question of the unsustainability for biodiversity and for climate of the industrial food systems, the food system. And today, 70% of the world population are fed mainly for the production of peasants and indigenous communities. So CBD must absolutely recuperate the view on the solutions proposed by those grassroots organizations, communities, indigenous peoples that are already as a real solution. The second point is that carbon markets and carbon offsetting has not led to any improving of climate change. On the contrary, climate change has worsened all the time while offsetting and markets has been in place. So this is not a solution. So it's very, very worrying to see that there are proposals to introduce this in a more aggressive way to biodiversity and to CBD. Biodiversity offsets until now has not led to the conservation of biodiversity, but to the displacement of communities in places where they can be destroyed because they will be offset in another place. And this is a way that the CBD must really question and not integrate into the post-2020 plan. The third point is that the CBD has already a concept that is much broader than the very commoditized and commercialized nature-based solutions, which is ecosystems approach. And the CBD should keep to this larger, broader, and more integrated concept, which integrates also communities and the rights of indigenous peoples and communities. And this is the kind of contribution that the CBD can do to the UNFCCC to show how the main role of grassroots food producers and communities and indigenous peoples. So we definitely, we as organization, but also in the CBD Alliance, which has over 400 organizations that participate in CBD, we very much oppose the use of nature-based solutions as a new concept and ask the CBD to keep the concepts that are already there. The 4 points I have is that there is one key point on climate change and biodiversity that the CBD can instruct the UNFCCC, which is to respect the decisions on geoengineering. Geoengineering, the climate manipulation, the CBD has a leading decision, the de facto moratorium of decision 1033. And in this decision, it asks all the governments to take a precautionary approach and to not deploy geoengineering. And this should be a very concrete point that the CBD should take into the UNFCCC to make sure that this is respected and not advanced solutions or so-called solutions that can lead to more geoengineering. And finally, I would like to say that I will encourage the chairs to please in next webinars and particularly stakeholder discussions to have panels where women are present and also more presence from communities, youth, and CBD Alliance, among other grassroots organizations. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia. I don't think Mohammed Bashir Yusuf from Gibbon Africa region wants to speak, so I will go to Oscar Guevara, WWF. Oscar?
Thank you. Acknowledging that the CBD's mandate is not about proposing quantitative targets on climate, like, for example, greenhouse gases emissions, reduction on the maintenance of carbon sinks. Perhaps my question was about how we can move forward on area-based targets that ensure that all sites of importance for ecosystem-based approaches for climate adaptation, mitigation, and disaster reduction, those places are conserved and effectively and equitably managed so they can achieve their full potential through the application of approaches that also ensures the ecosystem's connectivity, integrity, and resilience, and also ensuring that climate action avoid negative impacts on biodiversity and people. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Oscar. Before I go to Sue Campbell from Scotland, I'm going to read out a couple of questions so that they're also part of the narrative here. Both biodiversity loss and climate change pose financial risk. Could you comment on tools central banks have to mitigate biodiversity loss as public institutions whose mandates are to maintain financial stability? This is from Natasha Kunish. Then let me ask let me read out another question. If money could be a measure for sustainable economic growth, it would be possible to count your money while holding your breath. So I thought that was an interesting comment. Sue Campbell from Scotland. Thanks. Sue? Perhaps you have to unmute, but if you don't want to speak, then we can go on. All right, then we can go to Kim Friedman from FAO. Kim?
Jyoti, Susan is able to speak.
Hi,
okay.
Jyoti, can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you. Yes, thanks.
Sorry, I was having problems unmuting. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I work for the Scottish Government, and we have been leading the Edinburgh process for consultation of subnational governments, non-state governments, local authorities and cities. And we, through our Edinburgh Declaration, those subnational governments and authorities are pledging their commitments to implement the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework over the next 10 years. And indeed, one of our commitments is that subnational authorities, city and local authorities should deliver convergence across intergovernmental agreements and across the processes, and to take forward bold and innovative actions which result in mutually beneficial outcomes across those different intergovernmental agencies and agreements. So my question, given that subnational governments and authorities will be critical in delivering local and regional level actions for the positive benefits of biodiversity and climate change, I wanted to ask what the panel think, and how they think that the UNCBD and the UNFCCC can help that level of government to achieve the positive benefits that are really urgently needed for nature and people, particularly over this next decade. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sue. I will ask Kim Friedman from FAO if she wants to say something. Kim? Okay, then Mr. Tomoe from the government of Japan, would you like to say something? I know that you have a question in the question box, but do you also want to add something to that?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Please, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So as many people mentioned, climate change and biodiversity are closely interlinked issues, and so the collaboration between the two fields is really essential. And I believe that resource mobilization will be an important topic in COP15. So in order to make the best use of limited resources, it is necessary to encourage the interventions that contribute to both those fields and increase synergies between them. And other thing I want to mention is that I think the first step in collaboration between UNFCCC and CBD is to recognize that there are fundamental differences in approaches between mitigation and biodiversity. For example, we can monitor the progress in mitigation efforts by using common indicators, such as GHG. But in the field of biodiversity and adaptation, the indicators are very diverse and highly regionalized because we have to assess complex ecosystems. So it is necessary to identify areas that should be coordinated and those that should not. So based on this perspective, it might be, although it might be difficult to coordinate or integrate these reporting and review mechanisms, institutionally, but it would be very meaningful to share each other's good practices and lessons learned. And finally, I very much appreciate this great opportunity. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I'm going to take two final interventions and then give it back to the panelists for any last comments, and then pass the floor to Basil and Francis, back to Basil and Francis for any last minute observations they may have. So I have Natalia Urube from Regions 4, another very good partner of ours in subnational work. And I cannot pronounce your first name, so I'll just say your last name, Mr. or Ms. Tidada from South Africa. Thanks a lot. And then we will go back to the panelists. And I know there are several more people who want to speak, but you will have the chance at the next forum. Thanks a lot. Natalia? Okay. Natalia? No? Then South Africa, please. Mr. or Ms. Tidada? Okay. Then I can ask Zach Smith from NRDC if Zach wants to say something.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. I was curious about the, I had posted a comment or a question about the tipping points for biodiversity loss. And I think we understand the tipping points with regard to climate change a little bit more than we understand the tipping points for biodiversity, such as certain types of ecosystem collapses. And I saw a report from one of the investment banks, I think in Switzerland, that was talking about the cost associated with ecosystem collapse in countries around, some of the countries that it is impending. And I was curious if people had thoughts about how we should be thinking about those tipping points in the context of the urgency of moving forward with these issues, and also some of the timeframes that we need to be considering. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I will now pass it back to the panelists. Chip and Dr. Mathur, do you have any last comments? 2 minutes each, and then we'll give it back to Basil and Francis. But before I do, I just want to remind everybody that we have our Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming action agenda, which is for nature and people. And since it's a stakeholder and party platform, it's a it would be good if you could register your work there so that we can continue with the groundswell that we want developed. And you can, of course, write to us at any time if you have any comments on that. And I will pass it back to Chip and Dr. Mathur, please go ahead.
Sure, would you like me to go first? Very quickly, yes. That's a lot more very interesting questions and comments that I can answer in 2 minutes. But a couple things I wanted to respond to. This question on industrial agriculture and its role as a major driver of both biodiversity loss and land-based emissions is really central. And there's 4 things that can definitely be done. I would direct you to the work of the Food and Land Use Coalition, or FOLU. There's a report came out last year, Growing Better, which goes into this into a lot of detail. We're a part of that large coalition. Redirecting subsidies, we all know about that. Politically really hard to do, absolutely fundamental. Away from things that encourage wasteful, destructive agriculture, livestock practices, and towards more sustainable ways of doing things. Shifting diets, getting away from so much dependence, particularly in more developed countries, beef into things more plant-based options and things which have less greenhouse gas emissions. Food loss and waste, a lot can be done there. If we wasted less and lost less in the value chains, that would help us solve these problems. In greening our value chains, take responsibility of the effects of the production of different commodities on the ecosystems and the peoples where they are. So one big problem is that people in the CBD are usually not agricultural officials. And anyone who's worked in government knows the agriculture ministry tends to be very, very powerful and to get its way over the heads of those who focus on the environment. I would just mention on this point on the central banks and what they can do, given that their mandate is not climate biodiversity, is really important. And there's been a lot of talk in the course of response and recovery to the COVID-19 pandemic about building back better and various kinds of financial packages. And while obviously health and jobs and economic recovery are the main focus of central banks in dealing with that, there are different ways of doing that. And some countries have done better than others, I think, in incorporating the more green aspects into the work. The Scottish government point on subnational entities is extremely important. Cities, I mean, it's been very important in the United States here in the last 4 years with the administration pulling out of the Paris Agreement. We've seen states and cities really step up. So now that it looks like we're coming back into the Paris Agreement, we'll be able to come back, we think, with a pretty robust NDC on the United States side. And finally, on Japan's point, yes, there's not going to be a big deal at COP15. We won't make that deal unless resource mobilization, means of implementation, is a fundamental part of it. Strong targets, strong goals will also require a strong focus on funding. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been great.
Thanks a lot, and thank you to you for agreeing to participate in this webinar. Dr. Mathur?
Jyoti, the questions are really about a move towards a society where clearly biodiversity, and in the context of the questions that were asked, we are looking at organic farming. What I'd like to do is to bring attention to the Indian state of Sikkim, which during 2003 to 2018 focused completely on organic farming. They brought out a spate of rules, and it's very, very well documented on what they did. They brought out a set of rules. All their products were completely organic across the entire state. The problem was that these costed more. They were not competitive with the products in other states of India, forget globally. Ultimately, people couldn't sell. There was an artificial barrier between the state of Sikkim and the neighboring state of West Bengal to prevent food and vegetables from West Bengal, which were not grown organically, to enter Sikkim. You can imagine, all of this took about 15 years, but you can imagine the kind of tension that is produced. The chief minister who pushed this for 15 years, I mean, he was chief minister for 20-some years, great man, lost the election. Most of the rules that he created have been withdrawn. And the first organic state in India is no longer organic. I would suggest that finding markets is more important. That goes before you go on the supply side. Each one of us should be willing to pay more for organic produce. The place where we buy it from should be willing to provide organic produce in the markets. It's then that we will be able to influence the organized agricultural system that occurs across the world.
Thanks so much. And thank you also for agreeing to participate, especially at the last minute when we asked you to do it. So thank you so much for for participating and in this new forum. Francis, can I now pass it back to you and Basil to close the forum? Francis? Thanks a lot. Basil, do you want to start then? And we will wait for, we'll see if Francis can join back in. Thanks.
Thank you. happy to help. So this is the first of what we hope will become a series of forums. So we've learned a lot through this process. 1,000 registration, around 600 participants. I've counted about 20 intervention. One thing that stuck to me is the diversity of point of view, and that is proving the value of those discussions. I want to thank Jyoti for facilitating this, and this gives us a really good opportunity to hear those voices and to hear. So I think Francis is getting ready now, but so really we have the diversity of point of view. Lots of good points and good question, and happy to hear. Like, I won't be able to make all those points here. We've been asked by the Bureau to prepare a report from this meeting, and so we will do those, and then we will be including in the reports the written question and all the points. So I won't come back to each one by one. A few points that I do want to touch on. There was a question about gender balance in the way we conduct those panels. I apologize for not having the appropriate gender balance. We've tried, and there was some last minute change, and people are getting really busy at the very senior level, and we've ended up in a situation where we don't have the balance we're looking for. I can assure you that in the future we will be continuing to work on that. And in terms of engagement of the various groups, definitely this is the way this series is set. You've seen that we've deliberately went for participants and for panelists that are not from the parties, that are coming from different walk of life. So looking forward to that. But Francis, I see you're now able to provide your concluding remarks. So maybe I should pass on the floor to you. Over to you, Francis.
Yeah, thank you, Basil. I think the technology on my side here, I was trying to unmute and it was just refusing to unmute, but now thanks, it has accepted. So I would like to thank all participants for their very active participation, and Basil has already pointed out that we have taken note of very good ideas that have come through. These are very good food for thought as we go through this process. We all know that climate change and biodiversity is one of those very important topics or issues in the post-2020. So really, we also do understand, perhaps at the end of this webinar, that our understanding on these issues have been enhanced, because we think this kind of discussion also might help you when we go into the negotiations themselves, because this gives you an opportunity to informally share ideas. And we'd like to thank the presenters for really taking time to make the presentation. I think it was very useful. They were able to stimulate the discussion that we've had today. And to thank everyone again for allocating time for this webinar. We cannot take it for granted that you were able to be with us today. We would only say as co-chairs that let's keep this momentum going. If you reflect back, you will see that we began this process way back in January 2019. Today we are in 2021, January. And given the situations that we are seeing unfolding in the world, we should be patient with what is happening. But that means we have to be innovative and keep this discussion going. So this webinar is meant to keep this process alive. So thank you very much. We will try to, as co-chair said, address those issues of the others. panelists for the next meeting, even IPLCs, I remember something was said on that, the youth as well. We will see if they become available to contribute. So thank you very much, and I wish you all safe stay.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time. And please join our webinars next week. There is a whole series of them coming up in the next 2 weeks. Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.